All right, well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to our online audience, our in-person audience. This is very exciting. I'm Nicole Truag, Associate Director of the Center for Financial Security, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to Day 3 of Pathways 2013. Just a quick note to those of you who are joining us online, if you need technical assistance today, please call 1-800-442-4614. We'll be taking questions from our audience both here in person and online. So again, those of you who are online, to submit a question, locate the dark gray bar near the top of Media Site, click the Ask a Question icon, and a window will open. Please type your name, email address, and your question and hit send. We're going to have just a very brief program this morning before we turn things over to our keynote speaker. And I'm going to turn this over to Dean Soyan Shim. Dean Shim joined UW as the School of Human Ecology Dean in August 2012. Prior to making her way to Madison, she was director of the Norton School of Family and Consumer Sciences and Associate Dean, Strategic Initiatives in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at the University of Arizona. And I'd be remiss, since we're online today, if I didn't mention that she just joined Twitter. So I hope everyone will follow her. And the handle is at UW Dean Shim. So with that, I'll turn things over.
Thank you, Nicole. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to online attendees. Okay. I'd like to welcome all of the attendees to the School of Human Ecology and the Center for Financial Security at the UW-Madison. I also want to extend my special welcome to our online guests, those who are participating from all across the country and also around the globe. One of our goals for the School of Human Ecology is to conduct high-impact research, produce ethical leaders, and respond to the real societal issues. So this morning, we are thrilled to feature Ms. Helaine Olen. She will address all of these three goals: high-impact research, ethics, and real-time, real issues with respect to personal finance. So Ms. Olen, welcome, and we look forward to your keynote. And I also want to acknowledge our close partnership with UW Extension. And this Pathway Conference has been an important collaboration between the Center for Financial Security and UW Extension, which embodies the Wisconsin idea. Through this partnership, we are sharing applied research and programmatic information with the practitioners working to build the financial capability of families and individuals. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lori Boyce, who has been an invaluable partner for the School of Human Ecology. Dr. Boyce is a State Program Director of Family Living Programs and Assistant Dean and Director, UW Extension. Please welcome Dr. Boyce. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Shim, and thank you to all of you who are participating in our Pathways 2013 Financial Security Over the Life course. Here at the University of Wisconsin Extension, Cooperative Extension, we are guided by our purpose: to teach, learn, lead, and serve, connecting people with the University of Wisconsin and engaging them in transforming lives and communities. We hope that in this Pathways conference that you are provided with an opportunity to learn about new research, information, and tools to help you transform the communities that you work in and help build financial capability. I'd like to take a moment also to thank our planning committee, who has worked tirelessly to put together this week's exciting program. Family living educators with UW Extension on the planning committee include Carol Brolick, Washington County; Christy Cutts, Winnebago County; Ruth Schriefer, Iowa County; and Shelley Tiedemann, Fond du Lac County, all of whom are with us today. Chairing that work group was the invaluable leadership of Nicole Truag, Associate Director, UW-Madison Center for Financial Security. In addition, we are greatly appreciative of this year's sponsors for their support, and they include CBM, Credit Education Foundation Incorporated, who is our partner sponsor, and EdVest is our program sponsor this year. We are grateful to both organizations. In particular, I'm delighted to introduce Jim DeLeo and thank him for his commitment to the conference. Jim is a longtime partner and supporter of Cooperative Extension and the Center for Financial Security. In his work as the director, Wisconsin 529 Savings Program, including the Direct Sold EdVest Plan and Tomorrow Scholar, Jim is helping Wisconsin's families build a strong future for their children. Yesterday, Jim was a featured speaker with our Pathways audience. I'd like to turn this program now over to Jim.
Good, and thank you, Laurie. EdVest and the Wisconsin 529 College Savings Program are really happy to partner with UW Extension. And here in our live audience today, we have many partners we work with throughout the year, and it's good to make connections and say hello to everybody again. Planning for college is often a multi-generational event, as we discussed yesterday. And state-sponsored 529 plans have been around only for about a dozen years, but they do provide families with an efficient and low-cost framework to save for those inevitable higher education expenses. We also offer tools along the way to learn and develop good financial literacy skills, and the federal and state tax benefits help stretch those families' invested dollars. So I trust you gained a better knowledge of how 529 college savings plans, such as EdVest, are a good fit with financial security with your families this week. So today I have the pleasure of introducing journalist and author Helaine Olen. Helaine is the author of Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry, just published in 2013. The book has 40 pages of footnotes. As a compliance guy, that's my kind of book. She's based in New York and also maintains a blog on the Guardian's website and has been published in many outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Fortune. Olen got her start commenting on personal finance while writing and editing the popular feature called Money Makeover at the Los Angeles Times. We are delighted that Helaine made the trip to Madison. It's her first time here on the UW campus, and look forward to hearing more from her today. If you've read the book, you know she wants us to start talking about money. Let's welcome Helaine Olen.
Hi, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm already in love with Madison. I called my husband up last night and I said, one of our children has to go to this school. So they're 10 and 13. They will go home. I actually said, can you double check their sizes so I can buy them a sweatshirt, get the idea in there? So anyway, thank you for having me. And I want to start by thanking Pathways for putting on this conference. I want to send a special shout out to Nicole Truog, who did all the arranging, at least on my end. I think you did most of the arranging for the conference as a whole. And to Michael Collins, the faculty director here at the Center for Financial Security, and to everybody else. I've used a lot of the research here over the years. Somebody actually walked up and introduced herself to me already, who I've had correspondence with over the years. So it's been a really great thrill to get to connect names, faces, and voices and all the rest. This is not usually, as we all know, how we work anymore. It's all virtual. Also, before I get started, I want to thank everybody out there. Everybody, counselors, financial advisors, you're doing great work. And it's work that all too often goes unacknowledged. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to speak with an audience of people who want to help Americans with the most personal of their personal finances. On that note, I should get started. I always like to open by telling my own personal finance story and how I went from somebody who could charitably be described as an ignoramus to someone who, if not an expert, is certainly competent at these things. In my case, it starts around Christmas of 1996. I'd moved out to Los Angeles with my husband. I was freelancing. And I received a call one sunny December afternoon from an editor and writer at the Los Angeles Times, asking me if I could sub in for the Money Makeover writer and do the feature. And did I know anything about personal finance, by the way? This is what I knew about personal finance. I knew that it paid more than anything else I was doing at the time. So I mean this quite literally. I mean, I literally did not know a mutual fund from Mutual of Omaha. I mean, literally, it was that bad, okay? So I think this is a great background to which to respond yes to the question. So I say, sure, of course I know personal finance. I can write about this. What do you want me to do? So they start explaining the makeover feature to me. Money Makeover works pretty much like you would expect it would work. It's like a fashion makeover, right? Except it's about money. We get a subject with a financial problem, or at least they think they have one. They need to save more for retirement. They have a lot of debt. Their children need to go to college, whatever it is. We try to fix them up with a certified financial planner and other experts as needed. And the reporter is everything from the person who steers the piece to the fact checker to the writer to the unofficial consult if they don't like the advice, and to the coordinator. In fact, many years later, my husband will tell me, you know, your job was half reporter, half camp counselor. But anyway, I felt pretty sure I'd write one of these things, hand it in, get a screaming call from the edit desk asking me what on earth I had been thinking, telling anybody I knew this personal finance stuff, and I would never hear from them again. So in absolute fear, because at this point this has occurred to me, maybe this wasn't such a great idea, I run down to the Beverly Center where I buy a copy of Personal Finance for Dummies at the local bookstore. I then report the makeover, trying to nod knowingly as I am writing down terms that I will go home and look up in this copy of Personal Finance for Dummies that evening. While I'm at it, because at some point it occurs to me, I've got to do something to justify this check, I start asking our subject, who's a college basketball player turned pharmaceutical executive, about money, what it means to her, what she wants to do with it, and so on. And I put it into the piece. So I go home, write it, and wait for the angry phone call. I mean, I've just recommended, let me be clear, I've just recommended something called a variable annuity in the newspaper, and I still don't know what it is. And by the way, I should add, I still feel slightly guilty about recommending this thing all these years later, as I think anybody here knows. It's not the easiest or often most recommended investment. But instead, when the call comes in, they love it. They can't believe I put all this detail about the person's money life into the paper. They want me to do another and another. So I write about a Hollywood tech guy on the outs with his quite wealthy dad who wants to see if he could do it on his own. And the answer, by the way, was maybe. And a gay couple who owned a popular breakfast place and was feeling very overwhelmed by their life. And instead of getting the angry phone call on that, I just get a commendation from the local ACLU, because apparently I'm among the first people to ever portray a gay couple in the LA Times. It's just a regular old couple with some financial problems. Apparently we had, before that, been making a huge production out of it. And every time I expect my screaming phone call, and every time instead I get another assignment. And within a few months of this, I've become an expert. I suddenly know what I'm doing. And as I always say, there are a lot of things actually you can take away from this story. I think in the book I have 5 things, but since I'm up here I'll do 2. And they really go to the heart of personal finance and how they're presented to us. The first is that this is all a lot of basic stuff and pretty easy to learn. A mutual fund is money collected from many individual investors, pooled and invested in stocks, bonds, or whatever else. A 401k is, of course, a fund for retirement, and so on. Common sense should rule. If it's complicated and you don't understand it, chances are incredible you shouldn't be invested in it. It is, on one level, pretty easy to become a knowledgeable consumer. A lot of people would do quite well indeed to do what I did and pick up a copy of Personal Finance for Dummies and follow the advice contained therein. And in fact, I should take a quick break to say I actually find that to this day the most unintimidating book and the one that reaches the most people. I think it's something with the Dummies title, people's defenses go down, so I urge everybody to get it. On the other hand, there's another part to this, however, and since this is a Hollywood story, I will remind everyone what famed screenwriter William Goldman once said about Hollywood, which is nobody knows anything. Think about this for a minute, okay? We don't know how the stock market will perform over 6 days, 6 months, 6 years, or 16 years. We don't know when we'll retire, and if we will retire because we want to, or because our spouse suffered a health care crisis, or we were laid off in our 50s, never really recovered, and suddenly need to collect Social Security at the age of 62. And we can't answer what is really truly the most important question, and apologies in advance for sounding gruesome here, but we don't know when we're going to die. And this is, whether that day comes at 68 or 98, unfortunately makes a huge difference to your financial planning. So in another sense, I could be an expert because everybody or nobody was an expert. Over the years, I heard, reputable top planners say things like gold is a terrible investment. Again, this is in the late 1990s when gold is about $300 an ounce. Real estate is never coming back. Again, this is the late 1990s. California's just had a huge bust. Don't worry about the stock market, 12% average annual returns. This time it's different. And these are all people, by the way, I respect, okay? These are not, people on the radio saying this, though you'd hear from them too, okay? So I was an expert because my guesses were really, in the end, no better or worse than anybody else's. Yet, as a nation, we've allowed ourselves to be convinced that this is a science, and that with just the right amount of financial planning, we could protect ourselves from pretty much all of life's slings and arrows. Put money in your IRA, save faithfully, stir it occasionally, and you'll be fine. As we all know, it hasn't worked out that way for many, many people. So how did we get here, and what do we do now? And at this point, I'd like to go back to the year I was born, which is in the mid-1960s, and talk about financial life for a minute to somebody who was living that year. The credit card is less than 10 years old, and a married woman won't have the right to one for another decade, which people are astonished to find out about now, by the way. There were no ATM machines. I still remember when I saw my first one. It was really astonishing. If you needed cash, you went to the bank, wrote a check from your account, and they gave you the funds. And I think there's some people in this room old enough to remember being very bored children when their moms had to do that, and you'd be standing there like, oh, why is this line so long? If you wanted a house, you also had to go to the bank. And if you passed muster with a banker who probably knew you, by the way, you were offered a basic 30-year fixed mortgage. There was no variety, no questions, no docs, no 5-year payment plans, 40-year payment plans, nothing like that. It was take it or leave it. Second mortgages, what we now call, in a much more fancy way, home equity lines, were very much looked down upon, and they were not something you ever admitted to having. Sylvia Porter, the woman who we all know founded personal finance, who, by the way, her 100th birthday, total aside, is in a week and a half from now, she wrote about in her best-selling book in the 70s, Sylvia Porter's Money book. She called them, quote, unsound. And the tone in her writing is just like, trust me, somebody has dragged a dead fish into the middle of this book. I mean, you do not want to have one of these things. Jane Bryant Quinn has a similar tone when she talks about them in her early work, too. There were usury laws that stopped out-of-control interest rates on debt. Well into my teenage years, you could unload student loans, all student loans in bankruptcy court, which is a loophole that really doesn't fully close till the Bankruptcy Reform Act of 2005. And I probably shouldn't have used the word loophole there. I don't mean it quite that way. And perhaps most important change, there were no retirement accounts. Companies either gave you a pension or you saved on your own volition. It was, in other words, a heck of a lot easier to manage your financial life and a heck of a lot harder to get into trouble, even if you were in financial trouble. There were, as Steve Utkus at Vanguard once told me, just not that many options for people. A savings account, some life insurance, maybe a mortgage. That's it. As for the stock market, most people just weren't that interested. Even as late as the late 1980s, you really get somewhere between only 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 Americans invested in the stock market. It wasn't, despite what we think, that people were so much better at managing their money. They just didn't need to know as much as we do now. Then there's something else about that time period, too, that we also tend to forget these days. It's that we believed if people needed help, they should get it. The Great Depression was still a recent living memory to people in the 60s and 70s. And people kind of understood intuitively that really bad things could happen to people who were good savers and investors, and that life often did not work out as expected. People would tell you about family businesses that failed, houses that were lost. These were fairly common conversations still to have in the 60s and 70s, in a way you don't hear them again until very, very recently. But for us now, it's almost fashionable to think that everybody in that period kind of lived like the Waltons, happily in their multi-generational household where everybody took care of one another. This, unfortunately, I wish it were true. It wasn't, if you go back and read about the period. And I'm sure some people in this room know enough to know that this is not true. If you look at wills from that period, the elderly often left their stuff to various children with the proviso that they had taken them into their household during their lifetime. In other words, if you didn't take care of me, the best bed went to somebody else. If they didn't have money, they had this terrible, terrible tendency as the industrial age moved on to land in workhouses, which were as ghastly and Dickensian as they sounded. The vast majority, even if they were with family, died in poverty. Family abandonment of both elderly relatives and children if a parent died was not uncommon. To give an example that some people might know, the humorist Art Buchwald actually grew up partly in an orphanage at that point. It's very common and is still talked about with much embarrassment to this day. The chances are incredible it was in some of the families in this room. Again, it happened because there was no imagined past where people lived really well and handled their money or lives with savvy. Bad things happened. And during the depths of the Great Depression, we decided to respond to this. And we did Social Security. And in the 1970s, when inflation started to really eat away at the Social Security checks of the elderly, we added in the cost of living adjustments. We intuitively understood that elderly people should not be responsible for the consequences of a national inflation wave no one had predicted. Sylvia Porter, who was by now something of a cut-off fuddy-duddy living in a Fifth Avenue apartment with a servant who announced meals with a bell, and this is really true. Rich Eisenberg, who used to report for USA Today, told me all about it. He went and met with her once. Actually was writing columns at that point telling people that they should eat peanut butter instead of meat to save money, because 4 teaspoons of peanut butter has the same amount of protein as 4 ounces of chicken. I actually really did see this column. But most of us thought that was a pretty appalling thing to recommend and made sure our lawmakers knew it and that our parents and grandparents were taken care of. We do Medicare because medical advances suddenly make medicine much more expensive than the average person can afford. And we don't think this is a really good thing. We supported public colleges so students did not graduate with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. City University of New York, where I grew up and where my dad went, was free to all city residents until 1976. So what happened? Because we all know this world doesn't exist, right? Well, it's what journalist George Packer now famously calls the unwinding happened. Unnoticed by almost all of us, wealth and income inequalities start to open up. The gap begins in the late 1970s, and by the time of the Great Recession in 2007, it's something of, it goes from like a little lake in Madison to Lake Michigan. Today it is certainly at its greatest, largest point in our history. At last count, the top 1% of the population controlled 35% of our wealth. The bottom 90% were left to split a mere 23%, with the rest going to the top 20%. As for incomes, there's a lot of ways to look at this number, and just about all of them are bad for most of us. Our incomes fell by 12%, adjusted for inflation, between 2000 and 2012. The incomes of the top tier grew. My favorite statistic, and I'm using this term very sarcastically and loosely, shows that the top 1% gained an amazing 120% of all income gains in the first 2 years after the recession. And this comes from the inclusion of income and dividends, which were quite extraordinary in that period. And as for our fabled class mobility, our ability to, anybody could be born in a log cabin, well, that's pretty much a thing of the past as well, that we don't like to talk about that. Chances are incredible that you will die within the income range or one away from it that you were born in. And since the late 1980s, and this is a very recent study, there's been almost no mobility in this country at all, which is just extraordinary. But instead of questioning this initially, and instead of saying, oh my God, what are we going to do, we began to celebrate it. The stock market was on a roll after all, and so we all thought we were going to invest our way out of this. The stock market's going up and up and up through the period of the early 1980s, 1990s, through 2000 or 2007, however you want to count it. So it sort of covered up a lot of our sins. So when the 401k, which really starts as a tax dodge for high-end corporate executives and is meant to supplement, not replace the pension system, and the same is true of the individual retirement accounts, which are just the sort of same thing on a lower scale, nobody says anything when they start replacing pensions because we all think we're going to do it. We're being sold on this idea that everybody can invest and everybody's going to make 12% average annual returns. And another thing crept into our discourse, and we began to point fingers when it didn't work out for people. We began to say, not how can we help, like we had in the past, but what can we do? But what did you do wrong? And we had a very easy outlet because we all had to live. And something else was going on at this time too, and that's the explosion in debt. As everybody listening to this talk probably knows, because we're all old enough to remember this, it explodes. Credit cards suddenly get a lot easier to get your hands on. The interest rates, the laws on the usury rates come off in the late 1970s. So the banks now have an, incentive to give these loans to people because they're going to make more money if they never pay them off, right? So people, if they can't get by, are encouraged to turn to these things. And it's not because, as we all like to think, we're a bunch of lazy slackers who just really want their latte fix. Though I want to say here, I happen to like my latte fixes. It's because people needed it to get by. Again, I like to remind people, if for the longest time you couldn't accumulate debt. You just couldn't do it. So it was really hard to get into too much trouble. So by as late as 1980, our national savings rate is 10%. By the early 1990s, which is the combination of this opening of this increased access to credit and the income inequality, wealth inequality that's opening up, it's in the low single digits. By 1993, 1994, T. Rowe Price is warning that baby boomers only had 1/3 as much money as they needed saved for retirement. Literally nobody was listening. Nobody was paying attention at all. I go back and I look at congressional hearings from the period on these things. They weren't even being covered by C-SPAN. I mean, that's how obscure this stuff was. Nobody wanted to know. So today, just so you know, the savings rate is 2.5%, and 40% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. The chances are incredible. That includes people in this room or people listening to this webcast. And we know, by the way, that thanks to the great and important work by Elizabeth Warren, that these are not people that are buying too many lattes and spending too much money, taking too many trips. It's the cost of the things we can't live without: housing, healthcare, education, that have gone up at rates well beyond that of inflation, not for years, but decades. The primary cause of bankruptcy is medical debt. And most of these people have health insurance that's just not covering their bills. And it's also the jobs they're losing if they're ill. Student loan debt now exceeds $1 trillion. And according to Fidelity Investments, as of, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago, a student graduating in 2013 has $35,000 in debt if they took out a loan at all. 29% of baby boomers had student loans. As for millennials, it's almost 2/3, 64%. The group most likely to declare bankruptcy is single moms. This group includes the mother of Olympic gold medalist Gabby Douglas, who I think we all agree should have had her gymnastics lessons. And we're not talking about a bunch of spendthrifts. The median household income, as of last week, according to the Pew Charitable Trusts, is $23,000 for a household headed by a single mom. Which is a statistic I like to tell people to remember when they celebrate the fact that, women are 40% of heads of households are earning now. It's actually the vast majority of those people are single moms earning 23% at $23,000. So if you think you have enough money put aside to survive an event like losing your job in your 50s, or something we all know, or something we know dooms people to pretty much second-tier career status, or a medical crisis, I really hope it doesn't occur. You probably don't, despite what you think. I interviewed one woman for my book who went through, and I really couldn't exaggerate this, a 7-figure retirement account after her adult daughter was left permanently disabled following a horseback riding accident and lacked health insurance at the time. And as she told me, she said she turned up at the hospital with her husband, and the first thing they said to her before they even told her where her daughter was is they said, "Who's responsible for this?" And she said, of course, me, because what are you going to do? Say, by the way, you really should have had health insurance? It doesn't work that way. And then just for a final kick, her husband gets diagnosed with a very virulent form of Parkinson's, and she discovers that her long-term care insurance, which she thought was going to be excellent, was, like a lot of the long-term care insurance has turned out to be, somewhat less than adequate. As she told me when I tried to ask how on earth she had gone through 7 figures, she said, it was $10,000 here and $10,000 there. She is now in her late 60s and back at work, by the way, while she's trying to manage the daughter and the husband. So what makes this story amazing is she had $1 million saved. Most of us don't even come close. There are so many surveys, I can turn the speech over to the subject alone, so I'll reference the one that came across the desk while I was writing this, which is that 60% of people over the age of 50 do not believe they have enough savings, which the numbers say is probably quite right. Almost none of us have more than $100,000 saved. Some estimate, like Teresa Ghilarducci at the New School, thinks the number is probably closer to 30,000 if you do an average. As for the stock market, which might well be at record highs, that doesn't matter for the vast majority of us. Probably around 50% at this point have money in the stock market. It was up to 60% around 2007. It's come down a bit. And 80% of the stock market wealth is controlled by the top 10% of the population. And let me just explain something here. The stock market is not Rumpelstiltskin. It can't spin gold out of straw. If I have 5,000, you have 10,000, and you have $1 million, and it's all going up at 8% average annual return, guess who's going to come out ahead, okay? This is a fundamental math problem that seems to get forgotten a lot, okay? This is the miracle of compound interest, is going to assure that the miracle of the 1% is going to continue. So we end up with the society where the winners, think that they've just, done all these things by smarts, and some of it is smarts, but a lot of it is luck. And there's a lot of condescension. When children do this, these days we like to call it bullying. But when adults do it, we say you're being financially irresponsible. And I think it needs to stop. I think the problem goes much deeper than some wasteful spending. And we need, as practitioners who write about personal finance, who give advice about personal finance, who talk about personal finance, who are in our own ways quite virtuous. We're the sort of people who actually do think about getting our bank account before we get into the taxi. We need to start showing some humility. And we can all start right here. So, and this is where we all come in. When I set up my book, Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance, which is now called Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry, the original subtitle was How the Cult of Personal Finance Turned Us into a Nation of Dreamers. I didn't think of personal finance as being a dark versus light side. I wasn't really even that interested in the solve to the problem. I was really trying to answer a logic problem, or what I saw as a logic problem, which is, how did an entire country seemingly become convinced that savvy financial management and investment advice could ward off everything from bad luck to the economic plagues of the 21st century? From the vantage point of 2009, which is when I first started working on the proposal, spring of 2009, when the stock market was back at 6,000, it almost felt like I was looking at the financial version of a holy relic. Like you touch it and this is going to go all okay. So I start this book, and as I wrote, my goal shifted a bit. I should say I had stopped doing Money Makeover around 2001 and had, drifted away from personal finance. So I'm sort of coming back into this after an almost 10-year absence. I did the occasional story, but mostly I was writing about other issues. And as I looked at it and looked at whatever happened over the past decade, I became increasingly angry. There is no question that learning to manage your own money and investing well and saving properly and not being extravagant is a really good thing. In fact, I would argue managing your money is probably one of the most empowering things you could do. And in fact, I lecture 20-something women about this constantly now, okay? And yet, it didn't feel like it was enough. It felt like a lot of things had been, as I started to think of it, almost corrupted by the personal finance industrial complex as I began to think of it. Many wanted to help, but it became clear that there were huge problems. First, given all the other things I talked about, a lot of the best-intentioned help out there was almost a Band-Aid, no matter how you looked at it. And the example I really came to fixate on some extent was the world of behavioral finance, which I always loved, and I still love to this day. Give me a study about how people react with money, and I'm yours. I'll read it for hours, okay? But we took it in a way that it really perhaps wasn't initially intended to. We're trying to explain how people are acting around money, and people are trying to use it to get people to behave better. Well, that doesn't totally work, because what starts happening is people start thinking about things like, well, if we could just get people to automatically save for retirement, it'll be fine. But retirement's expensive, and there's no way around that fact right now. People are living longer than ever. So when we turn to things like automatic deferrals, which seem like this amazing good idea, right? A couple of things happen. First, and probably most important, the rate of borrowing from 401k plans starts to surge because people can't afford to save 10% for retirement and 10%, put aside an emergency fund. And they can't put aside money for their kids' college. They just can't afford to do it. So they start borrowing the money when they need it. The second thing that happens is as employers see people putting more money in, they start cutting back on their matches. So the numbers start to not work quite the way we had thought. As I like to say, it turned out the generosity of America's employers had a dollar limit. Then we had target date funds, which is another thing that seemed like this amazing idea. Just tell people to put them in and, it's all going to be fine. You don't have to worry about it. Well, the financial services industry quickly realizes that they're getting their hands on the most ignorant of ignorant consumers, which is a heck of a lot of people, and ramps the fees up on these things. With the result that you see target date funds with fees of close to 2%, which means in many years, people are effectively giving all their gains to the financial services industry. They might as well have done what my Tante Bessie used to do and take their money, put it in tinfoil, label it chicken liver, and shove it in the freezer, okay? And the final kick is, of course, a target date fund is no guarantee. It's just a good policy, right? It's what we think is going to work. And so after 2008, when a lot of target date funds, like everything else, fell about 40%, the response of the financial services industry and more than a few personal finance gurus, some of whom I know quite well, was to tell people to check the glide path on their target date funds, which, as I say, the average person thought that they were being talked to about a new tooth flossing technique. This is not something people think about. So what essentially happened was it was our risk and their gain. And then there was something else that is of dear love to everybody in this room, and that's financial literacy and capability. And I should say, I love financial literacy. I also, as I said, I'm somebody who likes to read Personal Finance for Dummies, okay? I was so sure this was a solve that when I wrote the proposal for Pound Foolish, it was actually in there as a solve for our financial woes. There was only one problem with it. In that same original proposal, I had a sentence saying, we've experienced in the past several decades an explosion of financial information on television, on the radio, books, magazines, the internet, blogs, you name it, it's out there. And if you look at the survey data, we are as profoundly ignorant as we were 3 decades ago, probably 10 decades ago, but nobody was surveying people then, okay? And so in answering that question, I feel like I fell down the rabbit hole, basically. And I discovered a lot of programs by the banks were really, in reality, little more than branding opportunities. And I actually found people willing to say that we're getting our names out in front of people, and the parents will get mortgages and the kids will remember us. I couldn't believe anybody actually said this to me. There's a lot of stuff that seems to be vaguely in the interest of the people promoting the policy, the various literacy agendas. Dave Ramsey's plans, for example, make no mention of the fact that load funds are not a great idea. Well, surprise, guess who promotes load funds? Visa has a big plan. It's actually adopted now by the state of South Carolina, where it never says once, per, say, Dave Ramsey, maybe if you have a problem, you should just cut up your credit card. Never once, okay? And the most important part of this is that there's very little evidence as of right now that it works. And at first, everybody's thinking, well, how can we get it to work? But when you think about it, well, why would it work? If people aren't interested, you're not going to make them interested. We don't tell children we don't expect our kids to take auto class and learn how to fix a car. We hope that they'll learn how to drive it, but that's about it. And given how well that's worked out, we're now looking at automatic, cars that drive you. So I think that might be a lesson in there right now. We don't take Health 101 and tell people that it's going to replace going to the doctor. In fact, if anything, we tell people, don't read too much online before you go to the doctor. A lot of the information out there isn't so great. What this works for is the financial services industry, who, as it turns out, were really using it to head off regulatory reform. Think about it. What makes more sense? Trying to teach people to parse a 100-page gotcha mortgage, or simply saying, can't do this, don't do it, can't do it. When you look deeper, as the great critic of the financial literacy movement, Lauren Willis, discovered, what was being passed off as successful financial literacy, and this is something I do think a lot of people out there are going to like hearing now, was actually coaching, either informal or formal coaching. The financial world, it turns out, after a few very obvious lessons, like, for instance, I think it's really a good idea to pay your bills on time, is simply too fast-moving and complicated for busy people to keep up with. People just need help, and simple, unbiased help. What does that mean? In an ideal world, it would mean no commissions. It would mean expanding the fiduciary standard as it is currently written to cover anyone who is giving advice or a financial product. We know the stats right now. The majority of people think that when they seek financial advice, they are getting it from someone who has a legal duty to act in their best interests, when the truth is no such thing. And for those of you who are wondering what the financial services industry thinks of this, because both the SEC and the Department of Labor have been trying to go at this for years, their response has been that they need to act in their clients' best interests. They no longer can afford to serve many of their clients, which is, when you think about the logic of this statement, they're essentially saying they don't have a viable business model if they have to do right by us. And we've, by the way, told people for 50 years this is what's going to save your life, okay? So we know that increasing access to unbiased help means increasing access to low-cost coaching. One initiative I really like right now, and I wish I had looked more into this in my book, is being done in New York City, of all things, by Mayor, Mike Bloomberg, who we now no longer can call Mayor for Life. Through his nonprofit foundation, he started offering about a couple of years ago free financial coaching for low-income people in New York City, and it has gone so well, it is now expanded out to 4 other cities. The only problem is it's still hard to access. Somebody at Business Insider called up a few weeks ago and asked, how do we find out about this? And she was told to call 311, which I don't think very many people think of for financial services. But before I leave the subject of coaching, I just want to give a perfect example of just how effective it really can be. And I will use a college example since I am here at the University of Wisconsin. Is a recent study looked at families applying to college and what would happen if they received assistance filling out the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA. And they discovered that children were both 25% more likely to both attend and graduate college if they had just received that one-time help. I mean, that is phenomenal. I mean, that is simply phenomenal. And as anybody who's ever looked at one of these things knows, they are incredibly complicated. So I will just limit myself to a couple of more examples of things that really probably should be changed. Payday loan lending should be banned. We're not going to teach people to avoid it. They need it too badly. Once upon a time, we thought usury was, and this is what it is wrong. We also, frankly, need to take a good hard look at our current retirement system. We know after 401k has been with us now for 30 years. If it hasn't worked by now, and it doesn't seem to be working that well, there's probably not a fix we're going to come up with that's going to make it work. It's probably better to do what some other countries are doing and looking at other ways of going about it. Yet, that's not all we should do. It's not just simply a matter of legislative reform. And it's not just simply a matter of telling people one by one, helping them out, filling out their FAFSAs. Because in the end, that's not truly efficient or even really possible. For all too many people, life in the United States has been like the economic Titanic. And sometimes it feels like, and I think a lot of people in this room who know about personal finance probably can identify with this, that you're on the economic Titanic and you're just pulling scattered people up onto lifeboats. Like if a friend of mine calls me on the right day, they can get steered away from disaster. If they call me on the wrong day, I'm rescuing them after it's happened. And in some cases, there's nothing I can do at all. And I think everybody in this room has probably had some version of that experience and on this webcast many, many times. As I was flying on the plane out here, I was reading an interview with the historian J. Jackson Lares, and something he said really jumped out at me. He said, we're in a situation in the 21st century where most of journalists and other shapers of conventional wisdom have known nothing but Reaganism and its descendants. And what he meant by that was the idea that we're all in this on our own. Among the things he listed as people would not have experienced was things like progressive taxation or seeing welfare benefits simply defended for what they are, not as a temporary fix, not as something only the deserving deserve, but understanding that some people just need help. We've all been encouraged in the past couple of decades to see ourselves as economic risk takers. But only a few at the very, very high end, and I think we all know who I'm referring to here, are protected if that risk doesn't work out. Most of us are on our own. And frankly, most of us are just not as powerful as we think we are. We need to admit that, as I came to at the end of Pound Foolish, that personal finance and investment is no more than an adjunct. And don't get me wrong, it's a great adjunct. It's wonderful. When it works, it's amazing. And as I said earlier, there's nothing more powerful than being able to manage your money. But no amount of personal finance and investment advice has the ability to save us from recessionary downturns, global economic trends, or pure and simple bad luck. Financial guru Dave Ramsey likes to claim that people can choose not to participate in a recession. While I've been known to joke that I would sign up for that financial literacy class if I could find it, the fact is there are thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people out there who actually believe that, and believe that the things that have gone wrong for them in life because they've lost jobs are somehow their own fault. It's extraordinary. I was actually at a Dave Ramsey meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I was in the basement of this church, and people were talking about their financial problems, and it was debt. And it was student debt, over and over again. And they were all blaming themselves for taking on this student debt and trying to pay it down. And not once did anybody say, why do we have $60,000 in debt for a 2-year college? I mean, it was extraordinary to me. I don't think that would have happened in the past. Personal finance started with Sylvia Porter in the 1930s as a way of educating people so that an event as awful as the Great Depression would never happen again. It did not start as a way of telling people they were on their own. It started as a way of actually telling us we were all in this together. And we need to restore that vision. We need to restore the vision of a society where not only do we take care of one another, but we expect help. And we expect help from our government and our neighbors to make the world a better place. And I'm going to tell one more story of also something I read this weekend. I don't mean to interject it, but it really struck me as I was reading Money Makeovers. I like reading Money Makeovers to this day. And it was 2 young families with several children. And they had debt, student debt, debt from the cost of childcare, from ever-increasing cost of kids. I think there was one case, the daughter was a pre-professional cheerleader. That apparently was $4,000. One had an underwater house. The financial planners assigned to the case sounded clueless, right? But then you're like, wait, well, what else could they suggest, right? This is a mess. Though, what could they say besides brown bagging it, right? Turning the 9-year-old cheerleader into a nanny for the twins? I mean, it wasn't going to work, right? But in one case, the financial planner actually expressed concern the family wasn't saving enough for retirement, which reading this profile struck me as like visiting the Jersey Shore the week after Hurricane Sandy and telling people that they better get their electric back on or they would swelter in the summer. Meanwhile, they didn't have houses, right? This is missing the main picture. They're accepting the world as it is. And it was heartbreaking. These were hardworking families with terrific sounding kids who were really working hard, 2-income families, the whole, one had lost a job during the recession. And nobody was saying something like, yes, this is a bad situation, but just so you know, in Europe, people pay for childcare. The state pays for it. Or, you don't have tens of thousands of dollars in student debt. So you don't begin life drowning in debt. So your savings aren't up where they should be when you have kids because you couldn't afford to put the savings away because you were too busy paying down the student debt. Instead, they were just talking about lattes and brown-bagged lunches. And I guess this leads me to my final thought. We don't talk about money in this country. We think we talk about money in this country, but we don't really. As a result, we think we're the only people who don't have enough saved for retirement. Or we're the only people who thoughtlessly co-signed our children's student loans and are now stuck. Or that we had made a fatal financial error of buying a house in 2005 with a no-doc loan because the realtor and the mortgage broker assured us that prices always go up and we can refinance. And anyway, everybody else was doing it too, and we'd never get a house otherwise, right? And I think we all know that was really being said, okay? We all make mistakes, and bad things happen to all of us. I always felt the genius of the Occupy movement, whatever else you might think of it, and whatever else it accomplished, which as we all know is the subject of much debate right now, was that it saw we were all in this together. It was, as far as I could tell, the first group to make the leap in decades that if your house was in forbearance and you were going bankrupt from medical debt, and this person's house was, this person had too much in student loans, that maybe everybody had a problem. We weren't isolated and alone, that something was not quite right here. So let's teach people the best ways to manage their money. But let's also teach them that part of the responsibility of managing money is to speak out and be honest. We live in a society where with each passing year, there are fewer and fewer winners and more losers. And all of us have a responsibility to change the situation. Yes, it's good to know how to manage your money wisely and well, but savvy consumers know that we need more than that. Savvy consumers know that we should be protected and that others should be protected too. So there's really only one thing to do in the end. Let's begin an honest conversation about our money. From there, all things will become possible.
We've got time for questions, and we'll start with our in-person audience. And just a reminder to people who are online, you can go ahead and submit your questions as well. So Michael's got the microphone if anyone's got a question here.
I'm Karen Holden, emeritus faculty here. I've always been a little disturbed that our financial education starts with ignorance, of this emphasis on how ignorant we are. I think it ties in nicely with your talk about we weren't really that ignorant long time ago, not long time ago in my life at least, and we may not be that ignorant now, but I think it sort of emphasizes the individuals, that if all of us needed education, or if this were part of like reading and math that we all needed to have, there wouldn't be this emphasis on ignorance that emphasizes the individual's fault. And I'd like your comments on just all these surveys that show how ignorant we are and why do we need them.
Right. I mean, one of the things that really intrigued me is it was pointed out to me while I was writing the book, and I can't remember if I got this in or not. I know it was in a draft. And I should say, I was frantically cutting this book at the last minute because publishers are now frantic that nothing go over 85,000 words, because apparently nobody will read anything more than 85,000 words anymore. And I'm sure we all have the experience of getting these giant books and like making it about halfway through. So I listened to them. But one of the things I had found out was that pre-World War II, you would often see textbooks from math or social studies, and what we would call personal finance, because obviously the term didn't exist then, would actually be woven into the text. So that you would see personal finance would be a math example, or it would be a social studies issue, of how did homesteaders finance their houses? Well, we all know how they got them from the government if they were out there for 7 years. And it was kind of just part of life in a way. It wasn't seen as some separate issue that you had to learn. The other part of it, of course, was there was a lot less to learn, but it wasn't seen like you were learning it. It was just assumed you would know this, and that this was knowledge you should have, sort of like learning to drive a car or something. But it was a lot less complicated and easier to pull off. That being said, I agree. I don't like the idea that, we're ignorant. First of all, I think as anybody who's had children knows, that is not like the most encouraging way to get people to learn anything, by telling them how stupid they are. It really does not work. Trust me on this one. I just think it somehow needs to be made, it's important, but it needs to be less of an issue. And I think it's become a major issue because there's a lot of money flowing into it, frankly. If you go into Google and start doing trend searches of the term financial literacy, it explodes after 2008. And the reason it explodes is because more and more programs pop up. And I really became quite cynical about what was going on. It became very clear that this was being used by various individuals and banks as a way of getting around their responsibility for what had happened in the past decades. So I literally found somebody at B of A, for instance, who was blaming, I forget what the exact quote is, if somebody had the copy of the book here, I could look it up, was saying, if this all starts with when it goes to University of Delaware in 2010, it says this all starts with the individual and the people who bought houses they couldn't afford. And, we all know what happened at B of A. I mean, they bought Merrill Lynch, which they couldn't afford, and was in bankruptcy, and they bought Countrywide, more to the point, which is what really set them into trouble. And, it's just absurd. I mean, people did not just do this to themselves. And I really became, as I said, quite cynical about the uses of it. I'm not sure that totally answers your question, though.
I'm Susan Fisher. I'm the Director of Financial Aid here on campus. I really appreciate your remarks. You've got a fan club in my office who watched on Frontline, and we're
thank you.
Totally, I get to go. In our office, Jim was mentioning people talk about, you mentioned the FAFSA and financing higher education is not a simple thing anymore. I don't know if it was ever simple. I think it was simple once upon a time. It was simple when I was young and stupid, but it is complex now. Where in your thinking does the intersection of family and personal choice intersect with societal responsibility? An example I can give you is a family from out of state, and if you are thinking of having your children come here, you might want to move here before you have them start.
It's still cheaper than private college, don't worry.
Because there's about a $20,000 cost differential between in and out of state tuition. But those families, we actually hear this, I've never told my daughter no.
Right.
I'm not going to tell her no now, even though we're coming from Missouri, New York, California. We know we can't afford it, but we just won't tell her no. I didn't grow up with, my parents felt just fine telling me no.
Right.
And so it's not a blaming the family necessarily. It's a Rubik's Cube, right? Why isn't the state contributing? Why is it so expensive?
Right.
Why aren't financial instruments performing better? Why were people told that they should take the equity line out and that would take care of their higher education costs and their house turtled? So there's that societal, but there's also personal family choice. There's an intersection there. What do you think about that?
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts there. And I'll start with the most basic, which is I really became convinced, and I'm more convinced now than even when I was writing the book, that the loans are a huge part of the problem. What it essentially does, not being able to declare bankruptcy with these loans, is it allows people to hand them out like candy. There's a reason the amount of loans debt has more than doubled in the past decade. It basically ties into the period of time in which you could no longer get rid of them. So prior to that, there was a control right there. If you couldn't pay for it, it wasn't clear somebody was giving you the money to pay for it. That's a big difference. And that's made a huge amount of change because people don't, how do I put this? People don't think, oh, I can't pay for this, right? They see the loan and the college is telling them this is a good thing to take out. As you know, there's been scandals where the colleges, I live in New York, NYU was one of them, Columbia was another, were all but in cahoots with some of the banks in terms of promoting the loans. I mean, it's disgusting, okay? I could go off here now for 15 minutes and I won't. So you had a situation where people were being told that this was a good thing to do. At the same time, you have another thing going on, and this is something that's not in my book, but I do write about a lot because I have kids that I'm actually quite interested in it, is the culture of parenting has really gone on steroids in the past decades. And I have no good reason as to why. That is, I don't know if it's some form of conspicuous consumption. I don't know if it's that people have less children than they used to. My guess is it's a combination of a lot of different things. In fact, one of the studies numbers that came out about a week ago is spending on infants has now gone up 25% since 2007. I mean, how? This is on my back list of things I want to write about, by the way, because it was just, the number was just put in an article. I was like, what? But I actually see it around me. I live in a building where there's a lot of kids, and $1,000 strollers have kind of become de rigueur. You know, when I had my son 13 years ago, you would be hard-pressed to find a stroller for more than $350. And that was high-end, and you really didn't need it. So there's something going on out there. There is this culture of indulgence, especially in the upper middle classes, this feeling that nothing is ever quite enough. My best guess is there's a lot of fear involved with it. You know, there are definitely parents that don't say no. I sometimes think when I'm in a really bad mood, there only takes one to buy the kid an Apple iPhone in the 4th grade, you know, and we have one of those at my son's school, let me tell you. There's always one. There was one in my older son's class too. And, you know, and then it just starts the downward pressure, right? And you inevitably give in because they're whining nonstop. I actually had to say to my younger son, who's in the 4th grade, you don't need a cell phone the other day. Where are you going? Your only independent life involves walking the dog, okay? There's no need for a cell phone. I only got my 7th grader a cell phone this year because he started taking the subway by himself. And frankly, I still wouldn't have done it, except there are no payphones left. And also, frankly, I got tired of being his social secretary. His friends started texting me. It was really getting annoying. But he's had friends, really, with cell phones since the 4th grade. I don't understand it. I really don't. But I do think it's a problem. And I do think people don't say no enough. And I don't know how to stop that. I really don't, except to tell people that they need to say no more often and hope that if enough of us listen, maybe it will eventually stop. But it doesn't. So far, it almost seems like some form of conspicuous consumption. You know, in the world of 2013, where so many people don't have anything, it's a way of showing you have. No.
All right, we're going to take, there is one question here from Donna, who's at a Navy military email address. And she said, Virginia Beach VA Human Services recipients and U.S. Army service members and their families are now offered participation in the Mayor's Financial Empowerment Passport program. Do you have suggestions about the simplest ways to market this idea to schools, communities, service resource groups? So if you're able to comment on the communication of programs based on what you've been investigating.
Please get word out any way you can. You know, the issue is try to get into the schools. People are desperate for information in the schools. Unfortunately, the insurance industry has figured this out. I don't know if anybody saw this, but Kim Clark at Money Magazine did an extraordinary story a few months ago about the insurance companies going into the schools and promoting life insurance plans for parents to save for college. You should know about this, okay? And basically all but lying to people and telling them that this is the best way to save. It's almost like a competition, and you've got to get in there. And I would urge you to try to get this into any school, any nonprofit setting you can, and to try to speak to people about it. Because you are competing with people with with much bigger pockets, unfortunately. Which is why, in the end, I still think legislation is just a more effective way to go, because at the end, you're swimming upstream and you're never going to win it. You're just picking individual people to get on a lifeboat. But the more you can get on the lifeboat right now, the better.
More from our audience here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jacob Moritz. I'm an economics student here at the university. I was just wondering, you talk about this a little more in your book, I think, but I'm sure it's something you're interested in. The financial crisis, no one really talks about this, but nobody went to jail for that. And that is a little disturbing to me. Do you have any ideas about that? Because why is that happening? Why hasn't anyone gone to jail? I still don't get it.
I get it, and it's rather sad and unfortunate. This is where I start sounding like my late communist uncle. We live in a society that's kind of controlled by the top 1% of the country at this point, and nobody has gone to jail because nobody wants to take them on, frankly. If you talk to people in the federal DA, in the federal attorney's office, and those levels, what they'll tell you is that these are very complicated cases and they're afraid they're going to lose them. I don't totally buy that. I think there's not a lot of, I think that's part of it. But I think the fact of the matter is people so hate these guys that even if they weren't guilty, you could probably, convict a dead fish right now, okay? I've seen these cases with the hedge fund guys over and over again where they say, oh, it's very complicated, you're never going to convict the guy, and the jury comes back in 3 hours and convicts the person. It's not that complicated, okay? Especially when you have them on tape or an email. But what they do is they fight like crazy. I don't know if you've been following the Enron saga, if you remember Enron. Jeff Skilling just is going to get out of jail in 4 years. He was supposed to be away for 25. He has fought his conviction nonstop, millions upon millions of dollars, to the point where the U.S. Attorney's Office finally said, we cannot keep fighting this. We simply don't have the resources to keep fighting this. We have other things to do. Which gives you an idea, by the way, of all the fines he paid. He managed to keep a lot of money. And I think that's part of the problem, too. They simply don't want to take this on because it would be like taking on, I mean, David versus Goliath isn't even the right example. It's like miniature David versus 5,000 Goliaths or something. And you're seeing this with the Dodd-Frank legislation, too, where every little insert to an insert in a law, in parts of the law, is being fought out piece by piece. And the SEC just literally can't keep up. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And I think that's what a lot of it is. And I think the last part of it is I think, and this is a rather sad part of it, is I think a lot of people in positions of power, this is who they spend their days with. They're not spending their days with you and me, you know, unless they're like at some campaign event, right? They're spending their days, this is who they're palling around with. And they see these people as their friends. Whether that's accurate or not, I couldn't say. But they understand them, okay? And they kind of feel, in some cases, I don't mean all of them, you know, Jamie Dimon didn't really mean to do anything bad, right? You know, the London Whale thing just was an accident, okay? And they take their side. And I think that that's a part of this, too. And I really do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Okay.
you.
And we had that same question from someone online, too.
Okay.
So I just want to take another online question. This is from Cameron at University of North Texas. And they're asking, for those of us teaching personal finance in universities throughout the U.S., how do we help students navigate the maelstrom of bad advice and also teach them about personal finance?
I try to keep it really, really simple because I think about this a lot. One of the things, you know, the obvious is tell people to live within their means, which is then I always say it's pretty hard to live within your means if your means are a $300 a week unemployment check. But in general, it's still a good thing to say. The other thing I've tried to start saying to people when they go to seek advice is I beg them to just remember the term fiduciary, nothing else. Because there's so many different types of advice out there that the only advice you really should be getting is from somebody who has a legal duty to give you the best advice. Because otherwise it just gets too complicated and the chances are incredible you'll get sold stuff. If you're not paying for it directly, the chances are somebody is who's not acting in your best interests, unfortunately. And to me, that's been the only way to say it, because I find that even if I say to people, make sure somebody has a legal, you know, ask that they have a legal duty to act in your best interests, the reply you will get back is, I would never not act in your best interests, which is not saying I have a legal duty to act in your best interests. The parsing in this world is really extraordinary. And that's another thing I would say, you know, just two bits of advice. And the third is, since she's in a college setting, try to avoid loans in any way you can. I know it's not really possible for most people, but try to avoid them. And if you're going to do them, make sure you use every federal loan that you can get your hands on before you turn to the private sector. Amazingly, because again, of the marketing of these things is so extraordinary, a lot of people are simply not taking the federal loans, which have come with much better protections and lower interest rates, and signing up for private loans even though they don't need to. And to give one horrific example of just how bad the private loans can be, is if that usually a parent co-signs, and if a child dies, there have been cases of parents literally hounded for the bills, and just no give whatsoever, unless they manage to get to the attention of somebody like me who will give them attention. And then usually the bank is so humiliated they back down. But again, that's pulling people onto a lifeboat. We've literally heard cases of parents whose cars have been repossessed. It's just horrific what's going on out there.
My name is Sherry Bester, and I'm a student here at the university, returning adult student. And I wanted to say I appreciate how step by step you just basically set the truth out on the table.
Thank you.
And I believe that's the beginning to solving problems, is to simply tell the truth and set it on the table and go from there. So I mostly wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted to say I was very interested in seeing you write a book, just simply telling the truth step by step, about a parent trying to make a plan financially for their child to go to higher education. Mm-hmm. Because if it was not for the UW-Madison People's Program and helping my daughter, she's a Honor Society student at West High School, but it was through the UW-Madison People's Program, through the Dr. Martin Luther King Scholarship, the Women in Focus Scholarship, the Madison Rotary Foundation Scholarship, the UW Credit Union Scholarship, the Madison Rotary Club Scholarship, that she's going to be able to go to school here for higher education. But I didn't have that in 1980, so that's why I'm a returning adult student now graduating. So it would be so wonderful to see you write a book just saying step by step for the audience of everybody all across America. How do you make a financial plan? By just putting the truths out on the table, because you've said a lot of them today. And so that's just basically what I had to say, that I appreciate your truth. And I appreciate the fact that my daughter, because of UW-Madison, all these people, is able to take her gifts to then make it a better world. And so within my community, so many people don't have that, though. And so in my opinion, it would just be so nice to just see those truths told so a person can go from there to financially plan for their family and their child with school. Just like from your book, now I'm going to take those simple truths and I'll make a better plan for my entire family. But everybody doesn't have that. So I just thank you for that. And I just am saying it would be nice to see you or someone write a book just telling the truth.
Well, I thank you. I should say, I'm not sure I'm ever going to do a book of financial advice anymore. But the person I love to read a lot of people. But one of the people I like to read who has both published books and writes online quite extensively is actually one of my former editors at the Los Angeles Times, Liz Weston at MSN Money. Mm-hmm. And she is just flat out terrific. I mean, there are a lot of other terrific people out there too, but I think she grew up in a blue-collar community, and she really gets it. A lot of, I should say, personal finance people drift into this. They often come from upper middle-class backgrounds to begin with. So they don't always quite get it. I mean, they're helpful, but there's a limit to their helpfulness. There's a level at which they're not connecting. And that is not true of Liz at all, who really, is like actually at one point called me up and said, reminded me that she said, when we were talking, about politics at one point and how dire the American public can sometimes be, she said, always remember, to this day, only a third of the United States has graduated from college, And that's something a lot of other people do not bring to the table. And so I really urge people to read her stuff online and just Google it. I could tell you where it is, but it's easier to just Google it and find it. They're always moving it around on their site.
Do we have any other questions from our audience here? I think that's it for questions. Are there any final comments that you'd like to make?
Oh, I'll start. No. Thank you for having me mostly. It's always really fun. If people want to talk to me afterward, it's fine. I'm always too shy to ask questions, believe it or not, in crowds, so it's okay.
Well, I think one thing I think that the audience might be interested in hearing, and you had written this, we had a Q&A going back and forth, but your own changes to your own personal finance that you've made after writing this book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't spend any less money than I used to. Everybody thinks I must be living in a cave now, like frantically hoarding everything, and I don't. I actually walked away from the book with the feeling that life is actually quite short. And, it can't all be about sacrifice. Not that I was doing that before. But what I did start finding I was doing was shifting a lot. I am more conscious of getting value for what I'm spending. I take a heck of a lot less taxis, but I'm more perhaps likely to take my kids out to dinner perhaps more than I should because they really like it. My older son is going to go to a cooking class. He really likes cooking for some reason. He did not get that from me. I'm actually shocked that somebody in my gene pool finally likes cooking. This is not in my family anywhere as far as I know. I moved actually. Because I felt I was not happy with where I was living. I really felt that you have to think about your money as part of an instrument to what you want to accomplish and what you want to do. It's really not, money's about, this is my take. It's not about the stuff you buy, it's about freedom and in the end, really. Do you have to tolerate a bad job? Should you tolerate the bad job? Because there's arguments for why you should that have to do with character development and lasting out bad situations sometimes. But ultimately, it's about the freedom as simple as to go to a doctor or not. And if you think about your money that way, you will start shifting how you spend it, frankly. On a very small level, and I said this once and got massively made fun of online, I don't buy cheap clothes anymore. I kind of stopped it beforehand because they just got sick of them falling apart anyway. But now I'm much more likely to, try to frantically hunch a very good blazer on sale than have 6 blazers. I mean, I have 2 blazers now. I mean, but they're both really good blazers, and they're going to last a long time. I just kind of got, because it's part of that same mentality that, more, ultimately. And Europeans, by the way, do this very naturally. You always hear, French women, their outclothes, they have like 4 different outfits, and that's it. But they're 4 really good outfits, and they look better than we do on a day-to-day basis. I have a friend who now lives in Paris, and she says the change is shocking. So that was really the change that occurred.
Well, wonderful. I'd like to thank our online audience. Thank Helaine, definitely, for being here and for sharing the information, and thanks to everybody for attending today as well. And Helaine's going to be here for a little while if you want to come up and ask any questions, or I've got a Sharpie, so if you want to get your book signed, if you're okay with that.
And I sign books.
Thanks, everyone.